The man she divorced to marry his boss stood in the hospital parking lot, snow falling on his shoulders as he watched his sick daughter shiver in the back seat of his rusted sedan. But what his ex-wife didn't know was that he had just inherited a massive trillion-dollar real estate empire after his mom died 3 days ago. She had left him and their sick daughter in the snow without a second glance, her designer heels clicking toward his former boss's Mercedes while their 8-year-old coughed blood into a tissue. But the inheritance documents in his coat pocket would change everything. He stared at the hospital entrance where his daughter needed treatment he supposedly couldn't afford, his phone buzzing with messages from lawyers about properties spanning 47 countries, but she was already posting engagement photos with his boss on social media, unaware that the man she'd abandoned in the snow controlled more wealth than both their families combined across 10 generations. The question burning in the winter air wasn't whether he'd use his newfound power, but what he would do that would shatter her completely and leave her lover devastated in ways neither could imagine. The February wind cut through Daniel Morrison's thin jacket like frozen knives, but the cold wasn't what made his hands tremble as he adjusted the blanket around his daughter in the back seat. 8-year-old Emma coughed again, that wet, rattling sound that had been getting worse for 3 months. But the emergency room copay slip crumpled in his pocket demanded $805 he didn't have. "Daddy, I'm cold," Emma whispered, her lips tinged with blue. But Daniel could only turn the car's sputtering heater up to maximum, knowing the decade-old sedan barely produced warmth anymore. The hospital's bright lights blazed through the windshield, promising help that remained financially out of reach. But Daniel's phone vibrated for the 17th time in an hour, messages from a law firm he'd been ignoring since his mother's funeral 3 days ago. His mom had died alone in a nursing home while he worked double shifts at Morrison & Associates, the architectural firm where he'd spent 12 years drafting other people's dreams. But she'd left him something in her will, something the lawyers kept calling urgent and time-sensitive. He couldn't think about inheritance paperwork when Emma needed a pediatric cardiologist, but the irony wasn't lost on him that his ex-wife, Jessica, had left him 6 months ago specifically because he couldn't provide adequate financial stability for their daughter's medical needs. The memory burned hotter than any winter cold could freeze, but Daniel remembered every word of that conversation in their kitchen, Jessica's perfectly manicured nails drumming against the granite countertop she'd always wanted but never appreciated, once they'd scraped together enough money to install it. "I'm done pretending this is enough," Jessica had said, her voice steady with the kind of conviction that comes from already having an exit plan. But Daniel had still been blindsided when she'd served him divorce papers the next morning. "Emma needs specialists, treatments, a life that doesn't involve choosing between medication and groceries." "We're managing," Daniel had protested, though they both knew managing meant he was working 70-hour weeks while drowning in medical debt. But Jessica had already mentally checked out of their marriage. "Richard has offered me a position at his firm," she'd continued, and Daniel's stomach had dropped because Richard Caldwell wasn't just at a firm, but was his direct boss, the senior partner at Morrison & Associates, who'd been complimenting Jessica's intelligence and grace at company events for months. The affair had been going on for half a year, Daniel would later discover through Jessica's carelessly unlocked iPad, but the betrayal had cut deeper when he realized Richard had been systematically undermining his projects at work while sleeping with his wife. "You're leaving me for Richard?" Daniel had asked, his voice cracking, but Jessica's expression had remained cold, calculating. "I'm leaving you for a future," she'd corrected him, her eyes scanning their modest living room with barely concealed disdain. But what she'd really meant was she was leaving him for money, status, and a life uncomplicated by a husband who actually loved his daughter more than his career trajectory. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, right before Christmas. But Jessica had wasted no time moving into Richard's downtown penthouse, posting photos of Emma in designer clothes that Daniel's child support payments supposedly provided, though he knew Richard was supplementing everything. Emma had started getting sicker right after the divorce was final, her congenital heart condition worsening with stress, but Jessica had responded by fighting for sole custody, arguing that Daniel's financial instability made him unfit for primary parental responsibilities. The custody hearing was scheduled for next month, but Daniel knew he was losing his daughter in more ways than one. A sharp knock on his car window made him jump, but when he looked up, his heart sank further because Richard Caldwell stood outside, his wool coat probably worth more than Daniel's entire wardrobe, Jessica wrapped around his arm like an expensive accessory. "Daniel," Richard said when Daniel reluctantly rolled down the window, cold air rushing in, but the smugness in his boss's voice made Daniel's jaw clench. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked, glancing back at Emma, who'd fallen into a fitful sleep. But he already knew the answer because Jessica's Instagram story 30 minutes ago had tagged the location at the hospital's parking garage. "We're here for Emma's appointment," Jessica said, her tone implying Daniel had forgotten. But he hadn't forgotten anything. He simply couldn't afford the specialist appointment she'd scheduled without consulting him. "The appointment is at 3, Daniel said, checking his watch that showed 2:47 p.m., but Jessica's expression soured at his attention to detail. "We wanted to arrive early to discuss payment arrangements," Richard interjected smoothly, his hand proprietarily on Jessica's lower back, but the implication was clear. Richard was paying, therefore Richard was the better father figure. "I'm handling it," Daniel lied, his pride the only thing he had left, but Richard's knowing smile said he saw right through the facade. "You're handling it?" Jessica's laugh was brittle, cruel, but worse was the pity Daniel saw in her eyes, the same look she'd given him when she'd packed her bags 6 months ago. "Daniel, your car is literally smoking. Emma told me you've been feeding her cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. You're not handling anything." The truth of her words stung because Daniel had been feeding Emma cereal, but only because he was saving money for her medications, sacrificing his own meals so she could have proper nutrition during lunch at school. "Emma needs stability," Richard added, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used in board meetings, but Daniel recognized it as the same tone Richard had used when systematically stealing credit for Daniel's designs over the past 2 years. "Emma needs her father," Daniel shot back, his voice low to avoid waking his daughter, but Jessica scoffed at the sentiment. "Her father who can't afford her treatment, her father who's living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the worst part of town." Jessica's perfectly lipsticked mouth twisted with contempt, but Daniel noticed the massive diamond on her left ring finger, new since he'd last seen her at the custody mediation 2 weeks ago. "You're engaged," Daniel said flatly, the observation landing like lead in his stomach, but Richard beamed with pride. "Just proposed last night," Richard announced, pulling Jessica closer. But the way Jessica avoided Daniel's eyes told him she'd been expecting this reaction, had perhaps even orchestrated this parking lot confrontation. "Congratulations," Daniel managed, though the word tasted like ash, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. "We're planning a June wedding," Jessica continued, her voice bright with forced cheer, but underneath Daniel heard the vindication, the proof that she'd made the right choice in leaving him. "And we've discussed Emma being the flower girl. Richard's already setting up a trust fund for her education." The implication hung in the cold air. Richard could provide everything Daniel couldn't, but what neither of them knew was that Daniel's phone continued vibrating in his pocket, messages from Rothstein and Associates legal firm growing increasingly insistent. "I need to get Emma inside," Daniel said, reaching for his door handle, but Richard stepped closer, blocking him. "Actually, Daniel, we need to discuss something." Richard's tone shifted to business mode, the one he used when firing junior architects, but Daniel's exhaustion was too deep for fear. "Not now, Richard. Your position at the firm is being reevaluated," Richard continued anyway, his words precise and cutting, but Daniel had expected this ever since the affair became office gossip. "You're firing me," Daniel translated, too tired for corporate euphemisms, but Richard had the audacity to look offended at the directness. "We're restructuring," Richard corrected smoothly, but everyone knew restructuring meant eliminating Daniel's position while redistributing his projects to Richard's favorites. "When?" Daniel asked, mentally calculating how many paychecks he had left to cover Emma's prescriptions, but Richard's smile turned razor sharp. "End of the month," Richard said, and today was February 23rd, but the timing was clearly calculated to hit Daniel at his most vulnerable, right before the custody hearing. "You can't do this," Daniel said, though they both knew Richard absolutely could, but Jessica's hand on Richard's arm suggested she'd not only approved, but possibly suggested this move. "I can and I am." Richard's voice carried the weight of someone who'd never faced real consequences, but he continued, "You've been underperforming for months, Daniel. Projects delayed, clients dissatisfied, quality declining. Every accusation was fabricated, sabotage disguised as incompetence, but Daniel had no proof. No way to fight back against a senior partner's word versus a junior architect's protests. "This is because of Jessica," Daniel said, the truth hanging between them, but Richard's expression didn't change. "This is because you're not meeting company standards," Richard countered, his lawyer's training showing, but Jessica shifted uncomfortably, confirming Daniel's suspicions. "We should go," Jessica said suddenly, tugging Richard's sleeve, but her eyes darted to Emma's sleeping form in the back seat, and for just a moment, Daniel saw something like guilt flicker across her face. "Yes, we should get inside and ensure the specialist knows we're covering all costs," Richard agreed, emphasizing the financial power differential, but as they turned to leave, Daniel's phone buzzed again, and this time he pulled it out. The message was from Harold Rothstein himself, the senior partner at one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. "Mr. Morrison, your mother's estate requires immediate attention. The valuation has been completed. Please call urgently regarding your inheritance of Thornhill Holdings and all subsidiary assets totaling $1.2 trillion. Time-sensitive decisions required." Daniel stared at the number, his brain struggling to process, but the message couldn't be real. His mother had been a nursing home resident who'd worked as a secretary her whole life. "Daniel," Jessica's voice cut through his shock, but when he looked up, she was studying him with suspicion. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Nothing," Daniel said quickly, pocketing his phone, but his hands were shaking worse than before and not from the cold. "We'll take Emma inside," Jessica said, moving toward the car's back door, but Daniel blocked her path. "She's asleep. Let her rest 5 more minutes," he said, his mind racing through the impossible message, but Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Daniel, she needs to see the doctor now," Jessica insisted, reaching for the door handle, but Daniel held firm. 5 minutes, Jessica. You said the appointment is at 3. It's 2:53. Daniel checked his watch, buying time to think, but his ex-wife's impatience flared. "Fine," she snapped, stepping back, but Richard's hand went to her shoulder, a gesture of comfort and possession combined. "We'll meet you inside," Richard said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion, but Daniel nodded, waiting until they'd walked toward the hospital entrance before pulling out his phone again. The message was still there, still claiming his mother had left him over $1 trillion, but Daniel's memories of Margaret Morrison were of a woman who'd lived in a modest apartment, who'd saved pennies, who'd apologized profusely when she couldn't help with Emma's medical bills. His fingers trembling, Daniel dialed the number in the message, but the voice that answered was crisp, professional. unmistakably real. "Mr. Morrison, thank goodness," Harold Rothstein said without preamble, but his urgency suggested this wasn't a scam. "I've been trying to reach you for 3 days. Your mother's affairs are incredibly complex, and we're running up against several time-sensitive deadlines." "I don't understand," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, but Rothstein sighed with relief at finally making contact. "Your mother, Margaret Morrison, was Margaret Thornhill before her marriage," Rothstein explained, and the name Thornhill sent a jolt through Daniel's memory. But he'd never made the connection because his mother never spoke about her family. She was the sole heir to Thornhill Holdings, a private real estate empire established in 1887. She'd been estranged from the family business for 50 years, but never relinquished her ownership. "That's impossible," Daniel protested, thinking of his mother's one-bedroom apartment, her budget grocery, shopping. But Rothstein continued undeterred. "Your mother lived modestly by choice, Mr. Morrison, but her assets were considerable." Rothstein's words were measured, careful, but Daniel heard the magnitude behind them. Thornhill Holdings owns approximately 14,000 properties across 47 countries, commercial real estate primarily, office buildings, shopping centers, industrial complexes. The total valuation is $1.2 trillion, and as her sole heir, it's now yours. The parking garage seemed to tilt sideways, but Daniel gripped his steering wheel to steady himself. "Why didn't she tell me?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking, but he remembered his mother's words at their last visit, 3 weeks before she died. "Danny, when the lawyers come, don't let them intimidate you. You're stronger than you know." "She wanted you to earn your own way," Rothstein said gently, but there was more to it, Daniel sensed. "And she worried the wealth would corrupt you, as it had corrupted her family. But she also left explicit instructions that the moment you inherited, you were to use the resources to protect your daughter's health and well-being above all else." Emma coughed in the back seat, that terrible wet sound. But suddenly Daniel understood that his mother had been watching, waiting, ensuring he became the man who deserved such responsibility. "What do I need to do?" Daniel asked, his mind already racing through possibilities. But Rothstein's response was immediate. "First, you need to come to our office and sign the transfer documents," Rothstein said, but then added, "Second, you need to know that news of this inheritance will break within hours. We've managed to keep it quiet during probate, but the business press has started asking questions. Your life is about to change dramatically, Mr. Morrison." Daniel looked at the hospital entrance where Jessica and Richard had disappeared, but a cold clarity was settling over him, replacing the desperation and fear with something harder, more deliberate. "Can you send a team to the hospital, St. Catherine's Medical Center downtown?" Daniel said, his voice steadying, but Rothstein responded with practiced efficiency. "Of course. What do you need?" "My daughter needs to see a pediatric cardiologist immediately. Money is no object," Daniel said, and the words felt surreal, but also deeply, righteously satisfying. "I want the best specialists flown in if necessary, and I want a full medical team assembled within the hour." "Consider it done," Rothstein said, but Daniel wasn't finished. "Also, I need information on Richard Caldwell, senior partner at Morrison and Associates Architecture," Daniel continued, his thoughts crystallizing into purpose. But the anger he felt wasn't hot and explosive, it was cold and calculating. "Background check?" Rothstein asked, understanding immediately, but Daniel had something more specific in mind. "Everything. Financial holdings, business dealings, professional history," Daniel specified, but most importantly, any vulnerabilities in his business structure or personal investments. "Mr. Morrison, I should advise," Rothstein began, his lawyer's caution evident, but Daniel cut him off. "My mother's instructions were to protect my daughter, correct?" Daniel asked, his voice hard, but Rothstein confirmed. "Among other things, yes." "Then I need to know about the man who's trying to take her from me," Daniel said simply, but underneath his calm tone was a promise of reckoning that had been building for 6 months, of humiliation and betrayal. After hanging up, Daniel sat in silence for a moment, watching snow accumulate on his windshield. But his phone buzzed again, this time with a calendar notification from Rothstein's office. Transfer signing scheduled for 5 p.m. today. Car will arrive at 4:30 p.m. to transport you and your daughter. Emma stirred in the back seat, her eyes opening slowly, but when she saw her father, she smiled despite her obvious discomfort. "Daddy, are we going to see the doctor now?" she asked, her voice small and tired. But Daniel turned to face her, his expression softening. "Yes, sweetheart, and not just any doctor," Daniel promised, reaching back to squeeze her small hand, but he was already formulating the next steps in his mind. "The best doctors in the world are going to take care of you." "But you said we couldn't afford—" Emma began, confusion crossing her young face, but Daniel shook his head. "Things have changed, Em. Your grandmother left us something very special," Daniel explained carefully, trying to find words an 8-year-old could understand. But before he could continue, his phone rang with an unknown number. "Mr. Morrison, this is Dr. Patricia Chen from Johns Hopkins Pediatric Cardiology," a professional voice said when he answered. But Daniel's eyebrows rose because Johns Hopkins was in Baltimore. "Mr. Rothstein's office contacted us about your daughter. I'm currently boarding a helicopter with 2 colleagues. We'll be at St. Catherine's within 90 minutes. Can you give me a brief overview of her condition?" As Daniel explained Emma's congenital heart defect, the medications she was taking, the worsening symptoms, but the entire conversation felt surreal, like he'd stepped into an alternate reality where his daughter's health wasn't a financial impossibility. "We'll need to run comprehensive tests immediately," Dr. Chen said, but her tone was confident, assured. "From what you're describing, she's a candidate for a new minimally invasive procedure we've pioneered. The success rate is 97%, and recovery time is typically 2 weeks." "How much does it cost?" Daniel asked automatically, but he already knew the answer. Didn't matter anymore. "Mr. Rothstein has authorized whatever care is necessary," Dr. Chen replied, but she added, "though I should mention that the procedure typically runs between $400,000 and $600,000. 6 months ago, that number would have represented an insurmountable wall, but now it was barely a rounding error in Daniel's new reality. After the call ended, Daniel helped Emma out of the car, wrapping her in a blanket, but as they walked toward the hospital entrance, he saw Jessica and Richard through the glass doors, standing at the reception desk with frustrated expressions. "The specialist isn't here yet," Jessica was saying to the receptionist, her voice rising, but the receptionist looked confused. "Ma'am, Dr. Harrington called to say she's running late." The receptionist began, but Jessica cut her off. "This is unacceptable. Do you know who we are? Do you know how much money we pay for these appointments?" Jessica's entitlement was on full display, but Richard placed a calming hand on her arm, ever the diplomat in public. Daniel pushed through the doors, Emma's hand in his, but Jessica's eyes immediately locked onto them. "There you are," Jessica said, her tone accusatory, but she noticed Emma's brighter expression, the way the child was looking at her father with trust instead of worry. "Mommy," Emma called out, but she didn't release Daniel's hand, but Jessica's smile was strained as she approached. "Come here, sweetie," Jessica said, reaching for Emma, but the little girl stepped closer to Daniel instead. "Daddy says the best doctors are coming to help me," Emma announced, her child's faith in her father absolute, but Jessica's expression soured. "Emma, we've arranged for Dr. Harrington to see you," Jessica corrected, glancing at Daniel with irritation. But Richard stepped forward, his professional mask in place. "Daniel, we should discuss the payment situation," Richard said, lowering his voice. But the condescension was unmistakable. "I'm prepared to cover the costs today, But going forward, we need to establish clear financial boundaries regarding Emma's care. That won't be necessary, Daniel said simply, but both Jessica and Richard looked at him with surprise. What do you mean? Jessica asked, her eyes narrowing, but before Daniel could respond, the hospital's main entrance opened with commotion. A team of people in professional attire swept in, but leading them was a woman in her 50s wearing an expensive suit, her bearing suggesting authority and competence. Mr. Morrison? She asked, approaching Daniel directly and ignoring Richard and Jessica entirely, but her focus was absolute. Yes, Daniel confirmed, but Jessica stepped forward, inserting herself into the conversation. Excuse me, who are you? Jessica demanded, but the woman barely glanced at her. Margaret Shelley, hospital administrator. The woman introduced herself, her attention returning to Daniel, but she crouched down to Emma's level. And you must be Emma. We have some wonderful doctors coming to see you very soon. I'm her mother, Jessica interjected, her voice sharp. But Margaret stood, finally acknowledging Jessica with polite indifference. Of course, Margaret said, but her body language made clear who she considered the decision-maker, and it wasn't Jessica. What's going on? Richard asked, his lawyer's instincts sensing a shift in power dynamics, but Daniel remained silent, letting events unfold. We're preparing our executive treatment suite for Emma's evaluation, Margaret explained, gesturing to her team, but Jessica's face flushed with anger. We already have an appointment with Dr. Harrington in the pediatric wing, Jessica protested, but Margaret's smile was professionally apologetic. Dr. Harrington has been notified of the change in care team, Margaret said, but before Jessica could argue further, the hospital's helipad alarm sounded overhead. That will be our specialists from Johns Hopkins, Margaret announced, checking her phone, but the revelation made both Jessica and Richard freeze. Johns Hopkins? Jessica repeated, her voice small with shock. But Daniel finally met her eyes. I told you things have changed, Daniel said quietly, but the satisfaction he felt wasn't about revenge. It was about finally being able to give his daughter what she needed. How are you paying for this? Richard demanded, his composure cracking. But Daniel turned to him with an expression of cold calculation. That's not your concern, Richard, Daniel replied, but he let a hint of steel enter his voice. Though speaking of financial matters, I'll need the remainder of this week off from work. Family medical emergency. Daniel, we discussed your termination, Richard began, his authority reasserting, but Daniel cut him off. Actually, Richard, I quit, Daniel announced, the words liberating, but he continued before Richard could respond. Effective immediately, you can mail my final paycheck to my lawyer's office. I'll send you the address. The shock on Richard's face was worth 6 months of humiliation, but Jessica grabbed Daniel's arm. What is happening? She hissed, her perfectly manicured nails digging in. But Daniel gently removed her hand. I'm taking care of our daughter, Daniel said simply, but Jessica's eyes searched his face for answers. With what money? Daniel, you're unemployed now. How are you? Jessica's panic was rising, but the elevator opened behind them, and 3 doctors in Johns Hopkins jackets emerged, led by Dr. Chen. Mr. Morrison? Dr. Chen called out, her team's presence commanding immediate attention, but she approached with focused professionalism. We're ready to examine Emma. Can we use the executive suite? This way, doctors, Margaret gestured, already leading the group toward a private wing. But Emma looked up at Daniel with wide eyes. Daddy, I'm scared, she whispered. But Daniel knelt down, taking both her hands. I know, sweetheart, but these doctors are going to make you better, he promised. But he glanced at Jessica. Do you want your mom to come with us? Emma hesitated, then shook her head, but the rejection made Jessica gasp. Emma, honey, Jessica started, hurt evident in her voice, but Emma's quiet response cut deeper. You said I was being dramatic about being sick, Emma said softly, remembering, but the words made Jessica pale. Daddy never said that. The accusation hung in the air, but Jessica had said that 3 weeks ago when Emma complained about chest pain and Jessica had been getting ready for a charity gala with Richard. "I didn't mean," Jessica tried to explain, but Emma had already turned back to Daniel. "Just Daddy," Emma confirmed, but her small hand squeezed her father's tighter. "I'll be with you the whole time," Daniel promised, standing, but as he followed Dr. Chen and her team toward the executive suite, he heard Jessica's voice behind him. "Daniel, we need to talk about this," Jessica called out, but there was an edge of desperation replacing her earlier confidence. "Later," Daniel said without turning around, but Richard's voice stopped him. "Daniel, whatever you think you're doing, you can't afford this kind of medical care," Richard said, his tone a mix of concern and challenge, but Daniel finally turned to face them both. "Can't I?" Daniel asked, his expression unreadable, but he saw doubt flicker in Richard's eyes. The medical examination took 2 hours, but Daniel sat beside Emma throughout, holding her hand while Dr. Chen and her team ran comprehensive tests. The executive suite was like something from a luxury hotel rather than a hospital, but Emma's comfort was clearly the priority in every design choice. "Mr. Morrison, can we speak privately?" Dr. Chen asked once Emma had been settled with a tablet and headphones, but Daniel nodded, stepping into the adjoining consultation room. "How bad is it?" Daniel asked, bracing himself, but Dr. Chen's expression was cautiously optimistic. "Her condition has deteriorated significantly over the past 6 months, Dr. Chen explained, pulling up imaging on a digital display, but she pointed to specific areas. "The stress of the divorce, the instability, it's all contributed to worsening symptoms. But the good news is she's still an excellent candidate for the procedure I mentioned." "When can you do it?" Daniel asked, but Dr. Chen's response was immediate. "We can schedule it for next week if you approve," she said, but then added, "I should mention that this procedure is cutting edge. Only 12 hospitals in the world perform it, and we've had the highest success rate." "Do it," Daniel said without hesitation, but Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Chen continued, her expression growing serious, but Daniel sensed she was choosing her words carefully. "Emma's medical records show inconsistent care over the past 6 months, missed appointments, delayed prescription refills, gaps in her monitoring." The implication was clear, but Daniel's jaw tightened. "Her mother had primary custody," Daniel explained, but the words tasted bitter. "I see," Dr. Chen said, and her professional neutrality couldn't quite hide her disapproval. But she continued, "Going forward, Emma will need consistent, attentive care. The procedure will buy us time, but she'll require regular monitoring for the rest of her life." "She'll have it," Daniel promised. But his phone vibrated with a message from Rothstein. "Car arriving in 10 minutes, documents ready for signature." When Daniel returned to the examination room, but Emma was asleep, exhausted from the tests. Dr. Chen had ordered her admitted overnight for observation and to begin pre-surgical protocols, but Daniel made arrangements for a private nurse before heading back to the waiting area. Jessica and Richard were still there, but their earlier confidence had eroded. But Jessica jumped up when she saw Daniel. "What did the doctors say?" she demanded, but her voice was strained with worry. "She needs surgery. Next week," Daniel said, but he didn't elaborate. "Surgery? What kind of surgery?" Jessica's maternal instincts finally overrode her other concerns, but Richard's hand on her shoulder seemed more restraining than comforting now. "A specialized procedure to repair her heart defect," Daniel explained, but he was already looking past them towards the exit. "How much will it cost?" Richard asked, and there it was. But the question revealed his priorities. "It's handled," Daniel replied shortly, but Jessica grabbed his arm again. "Daniel, please, you need to tell me what's going on," she pleaded, but for the first time Daniel saw genuine fear in her eyes. Fear that she was losing control of a situation she'd previously dominated. What's going on is that our daughter is getting the medical care she needs, Daniel said, his voice hard, but he softened slightly. She's being admitted overnight. You can visit her tomorrow. Tomorrow? I'm her mother. I should stay with her, Jessica protested, but Daniel's expression remained firm. She asked for me, Daniel said simply, the truth of it landing like a blow. But before Jessica could argue, a man in a chauffeur's uniform approached. Mr. Morrison, your car is ready, the man announced, but his professional bearing and the keys to what was clearly a luxury vehicle made both Jessica and Richard stare. Thank you, Daniel said, turning to follow, but Jessica's voice rose with desperation. Daniel Morrison, you tell me what the hell is happening right now, she shouted, drawing attention from other people in the waiting area. But Daniel paused, considering his response. He could tell her now, watch her realize the magnitude of her mistake in real time. But something held him back, a desire to let the revelation unfold more dramatically. You'll find out soon enough, Daniel said instead, but he met Richard's eyes with cold promise. Both of you. The car waiting outside was a Mercedes S-Class, and the driver held the door open, but as Daniel slid into the leather interior, he saw Jessica and Richard through the hospital's glass doors, their body language screaming confusion and growing panic. The drive to Rothstein and Associates took 30 minutes through downtown traffic, but Daniel used the time to process everything that had happened in the past 3 hours. His phone had started buzzing with messages and calls from numbers he didn't recognize, but a quick Google search of his own name revealed why. The first headline hit him like a physical blow. Secret billionaire junior architect inherits $1.2 trillion real estate empire. The article was barely an hour old, but it already had thousands of shares and the comments section was exploding with speculation. Someone had leaked the story, but Daniel suspected it was intentional. Rothstein's way of ensuring the business world knew the Thornhill fortune had a new owner. His phone rang with a call from his apartment building's landlord, but Daniel declined it, already knowing what that conversation would be. Within hours, probably everyone from his past would be reaching out, but very few of them would have pure intentions. Another headline caught his eye. Thornhill Holdings' heir was living in poverty while sitting on trillion-dollar fortune. The narrative was already being crafted, but Daniel knew the media would make him either a hero or a villain, depending on how he handled the next few days. Rothstein and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a Manhattan skyscraper, but when Daniel arrived, he was immediately escorted to a private conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Harold Rothstein was a distinguished man in his 60s, his gray hair and sharp suit projecting authority, but his handshake was warm, genuine. Mr. Morrison, I'm deeply sorry for your loss, Rothstein began, but his eyes conveyed sincerity beyond professional courtesy. Your mother was an extraordinary woman. I'm beginning to realize I didn't know her as well as I thought, Daniel admitted, but Rothstein smiled sadly. She wanted it that way, he explained, gesturing for Daniel to sit at the massive conference table, but spread across its surface were documents, property portfolios, and corporate reports. Margaret believed that character was forged in struggle, not comfort. She watched you for years, Mr. Morrison, watched you work multiple jobs to support your daughter, watched you maintain your integrity when others would have compromised, watched you choose being a present father over climbing the corporate ladder. The revelation made Daniel's throat tight, but he managed to ask, "She was testing me?" "Not testing," Rothstein corrected gently, but he opened a leather folder containing a handwritten letter. "She was ensuring, this is for you. She wrote it 3 years ago and updated it monthly until her death." Daniel took the letter with shaking hands, but his mother's familiar handwriting blurred as tears filled his eyes. "My dearest Danny," the letter began, but he had to pause to collect himself before continuing. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're about to inherit a burden I've carried for 50 years. The Thornhill fortune is both a blessing and a curse, and I've seen it destroy more lives than it's enriched. I left my family when I was 20 because the money corrupted everything it touched. My father used it to control people. My brothers fought over it like dogs over a bone. My cousins became parasites who never worked a day in their lives. I wanted a different life, a real life, and I found it with your father. We were poor, but we were happy. When he died, I could have returned to the family fortune, but I chose to raise you the way we'd planned together, with values, with purpose, with the understanding that wealth without character is worthless. I've watched you become a man your father would be proud of. You've faced hardship with grace, loved your daughter with selfless devotion, and maintained your integrity when it would have been easier to compromise. You're ready for this responsibility now, even though you'll doubt yourself. Use the money to protect Emma. Use it to build something meaningful. Use it to make the world better, not to make yourself comfortable. And remember that the truest wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in the people we love and the lives we touch. I'm so proud of you, Danny. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this in person, but I was a coward at the end, afraid you'd be angry I kept this secret. Forgive an old woman her fears, and know that every day of your struggle was building you into the man who deserves this inheritance. All my love, Mom. Daniel wiped his eyes, but the letter's weight was almost physical. His mother had been watching him struggle, could have helped at any time, but she'd trusted him to forge his own path. She loved you very much, Rothstein said quietly, but he pushed a stack of documents forward. Now, let's discuss what you've inherited and what decisions need to be made immediately. The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of information, but Daniel's architectural training helped him visualize the global empire his mother had built. Thornhill Holdings owned landmark properties in every major city, office towers in New York, shopping centers in London, industrial complexes in Singapore, luxury hotels in Dubai. The total revenue last year was $47 billion, Rothstein explained, but he added, after operating expenses and reinvestment, the net profit was $12 billion. That's your annual income, Mr. Morrison. Daniel's brain struggled to process numbers that large, but Rothstein continued methodically through the portfolio. You also have a personal fortune from your mother's liquid assets, stocks, bonds, cash reserves, totaling approximately $340 million, Rothstein said, but he was already moving on to the next item. The board of directors has been managing the company in your mother's absence, but they'll need direction from you going forward. I don't know anything about running a real estate empire, Daniel protested, but Rothstein's smile was reassuring. Your mother didn't expect you to learn overnight, he said, but he pulled out another folder. She's arranged for a transition team to work with you, industry experts, financial advisors, legal counsel. They'll guide you through the first year while you learn the business. What did my mother do with all this money? Daniel asked suddenly, but the question had been nagging at him. Rothstein's expression softened with respect, but he opened yet another folder, this one filled with charitable giving reports. She anonymously funded over 200 charitable organizations, Rothstein explained, but the numbers were staggering. Children's hospitals, medical research, educational programs, poverty relief. She gave away approximately $8 billion over the past 30 years. Daniel's mother had been secretly one of the world's greatest philanthropists, but she'd lived in a modest apartment and clipped coupons while doing it. She wanted you to continue her charitable work, Rothstein said, but he added, though she also wanted you to enjoy life in ways she never allowed herself. Balance, she called it. After signing what felt like 1,000 documents, but was actually 47 separate legal instruments, Daniel emerged from the conference room as the legal owner of Thornhill Holdings. There's one more thing, Rothstein said as Daniel prepared to leave, but his expression turned serious. You asked me to research Richard Caldwell. Daniel had almost forgotten his earlier request, but Rothstein's tone suggested interesting findings. "What did you discover?" Daniel asked, but he was already anticipating the answer. "Morrison and Associates architecture is heavily leveraged," Rothstein explained, pulling up financial documents on his tablet, but the numbers told a story of corporate mismanagement. Richard Caldwell has been using company assets as collateral for personal investments, several of which have failed spectacularly. The firm is approximately $45 million in debt. "That's not public knowledge," Daniel guessed, but Rothstein confirmed with a nod. "They've been hiding it through creative accounting," Rothstein said, but he continued. "More interestingly, the firm's primary creditor is Caldwell Holdings, Richard's family company. He's essentially been loaning the firm money to cover the debt he created, putting the company in a position where he has total control." "How long until it collapses?" Daniel asked, but he was thinking strategically now. "Without a significant capital infusion, 6 months, maybe 8, Rothstein estimated, but he looked at Daniel curiously. "May I ask why you're interested?" "Because I'm going to buy Morrison and Associates," Daniel said simply, but the plan was crystallizing in his mind. "Can you make it happen?" Rothstein's smile was sharp with understanding, but he nodded slowly. "The firm is privately held, so we'd need to approach the board of directors directly. With Richard's financial troubles, they might be motivated to sell. But Mr. Morrison buying the company solely for revenge—" "Not solely for revenge," Daniel interrupted, but his expression hardened. "Morrison and Associates has talented architects, good clients, solid reputation. Richard has been running it into the ground through mismanagement and ego. I can save jobs, preserve the firm's legacy, and yes, ensure Richard Caldwell faces consequences for his actions." Multitasking, Rothstein observed with approval, but he made notes on his tablet. "I'll have a proposal ready by tomorrow morning. If you're serious about this, we'll need to move quickly before anyone else realizes the firm is vulnerable." "I'm serious," Daniel confirmed, but he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Also, I need you to quietly purchase the building where Richard's penthouse is located. The whole building." "May I ask your intention?" Rothstein asked, but his tone suggested he already knew. "Richard's lease expires in 4 months, Daniel said, but his smile was cold. "I want to be his landlord when it does." "Poetic," Rothstein acknowledged, but he added the item to his list. "Though I should mention that personal vendettas, while satisfying, can become complicated." "This isn't just about satisfaction," Daniel said, his voice hard, but he met Rothstein's eyes. "Richard Caldwell systematically destroyed my career, stole my wife, and is now trying to take my daughter. He fired me this afternoon specifically to hurt me before the custody hearing. Every action I take against him is defensive." "Defensive," Rothstein repeated, his lawyer's mind clearly appreciating the framing, but he nodded. "We'll ensure everything is legally unassailable." By the time Daniel left Rothstein's office, it was after 8 p.m., but his phone had exploded with messages and missed calls. The news of his inheritance had spread like wildfire, but the social dynamics of his life were already shifting in real time. There were messages from former colleagues suddenly wanting to catch up, but Daniel had ignored them all. His apartment building's landlord had called 6 times, but Daniel knew that conversation could wait. Jessica had texted 17 times, each message more desperate than the last. But Richard had also called twice, his voicemails dripping with forced congeniality. Only one message mattered. The hospital had sent an update that Emma was stable, comfortable, and asking for him, but visiting hours were over until morning. Daniel instructed his new driver to take him home, but home felt like a relic from a different lifetime. The 1-bedroom apartment in a rough neighborhood seemed even smaller now, but Daniel knew he'd need to find new housing soon, somewhere safe and comfortable for Emma's recovery. His phone rang with an unknown number, But when Daniel answered, a professional voice introduced herself as Melissa Chen from Global Estate Management. "Mr. Morrison, Harold Rothstein referred me," she explained, but her tone was brisk, efficient. "I understand you need immediate housing arrangements. I have 3 properties available for viewing tomorrow, all fully furnished, all in excellent school districts for your daughter." "That fast?" Daniel asked, surprised, but Melissa's laugh was knowing. "Mr. Rothstein is very efficient," she said, but she continued, "I've compiled a portfolio based on your needs: security, privacy, proximity to St. Catherine's Medical Center for Emma's post-surgical care, and appropriate spaces for a child's recovery. The first property is a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, 5 bedrooms, private garden." "Send me the details," Daniel interrupted, suddenly exhausted, but he appreciated the competence. "I'll make a decision tomorrow." "Of course," Melissa agreed, but she added, "Mr. Rothstein also suggested I inform you that several media outlets are requesting interviews. Should I coordinate a statement?" "No interviews," Daniel said firmly, but he was already thinking about how this would play out publicly. "Not yet, but prepare a brief statement about my commitment to continuing my mother's charitable work and ensuring Emma's health is the first priority." "Perfect," Melissa said, but she was clearly typing notes. "I'll have it ready for your approval in an hour." After hanging up, Daniel sat in his small apartment surrounded by the trappings of his former life, but everything felt temporary now, like a costume he'd been wearing that no longer fit. His phone buzzed again. Jessica calling. But Daniel let it go to voicemail. Whatever she wanted to say could wait until he'd processed everything, but her voicemail was revealing. "Daniel, I don't know what's happening, but the internet is saying you inherited billions of dollars. That can't be real. Call me back. We need to talk about Emma, about the custody hearing. Richard says, just call me back, Daniel, please." The desperation in her voice was obvious, but Daniel felt no satisfaction, only a dull ache for the marriage they'd once had, before money and status had corrupted everything. He fell asleep on his worn couch, but his dreams were full of his mother's voice, reading her letter over and over. "The truest wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in the people we love and the lives we touch." The next morning, Daniel arrived at St. Catherine's Medical Center at 7 a.m., but Emma was already awake, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Daddy, the nurses say I get to have pancakes for breakfast," Emma announced, but her excitement was the best medicine Daniel could imagine. "Chocolate chip pancakes?" Daniel asked, sitting beside her bed, but Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Dr. Chen says the surgery will make me feel so much better," Emma continued, her child's faith in adult promises absolute, but Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "She's the best, sweetheart. You're going to be healthy and strong," Daniel promised. But the door opened behind them and Jessica entered. She looked terrible, but Daniel noticed the expensive clothes couldn't hide the sleepless night evident in her face. Dark circles under her eyes, makeup hastily applied, but her focus went immediately to Emma. "Baby!" Jessica rushed to the bedside, but Emma's greeting was subdued. "Hi, Mom," Emma said, not pulling away, but not embracing her mother either. But the distance was palpable. "I was so worried," Jessica said, her hands hovering over Emma like she wasn't sure where to touch, but her eyes kept darting to Daniel. "The doctors won't tell me anything. They say only your father has medical decision-making authority." "That's correct," Daniel confirmed, but he kept his tone neutral for Emma's sake. "Daniel, we need to talk," Jessica said, her voice strained, but she glanced at Emma. "Privately." "Emma, can you give us a few minutes?" Daniel asked his daughter, but Emma looked worried. "Are you going to fight?" she asked, her small voice revealing how much the divorce had affected her. But Daniel shook his head. "No fighting, promise," Daniel assured her, but he picked up the tablet Dr. Chen had left. "Here, watch your show. We'll be right outside." In the hallway, Jessica's composure finally cracked, but her mask of perfection slipped to reveal genuine panic underneath. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice low but intense. But Daniel knew what she was asking. "Is what true, Jessica?" Daniel asked, making her say it. But she pulled out her phone, showing him article after article about his inheritance. This, all of this. Did you really inherit over $1 trillion? Jessica's hands were shaking, but Daniel noticed the massive engagement ring was conspicuously absent from her finger. "Yes," Daniel confirmed simply, but he watched her process the information in real time. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jessica asked, and the audacity of the question almost made Daniel laugh, but he kept his expression neutral. "I found out yesterday, Jessica, in the hospital parking lot, right before you and Richard informed me I was being fired." Daniel's words were measured, but the implications hung between them. Jessica's face went through several expressions, but settled on something that looked like horror mixed with regret. "Oh my God," she whispered, but her mind was clearly racing through scenarios. "Daniel, I didn't know. You have to believe I didn't know." "About the inheritance, I believe you," Daniel said, but he continued coldly. "About Richard's financial troubles and his plan to fire me before the custody hearing, that I'm less sure about." "What financial troubles?" Jessica asked, confusion evident. But Daniel studied her face and realized she genuinely didn't know. "Richard's company is bankrupt," Daniel explained, watching her reaction, but Jessica's expression shifted from confusion to denial. "That's not possible. Richard's family is wealthy, his firm is successful." Jessica protested, but Daniel cut her off. "His family was wealthy. Morrison and Associates is leveraged to the point of collapse. He's been using your relationship with me to hide his professional failures," Daniel said brutally. But the truth needed to land. "The firing wasn't about my performance. It was about eliminating the connection between his public success and his private catastrophe." Jessica leaned against the hospital wall, her perfectly styled appearance crumbling, but Daniel felt no satisfaction in her distress. "Is that why you bought the firm?" Jessica asked suddenly, but Daniel's eyebrows rose. "How did you know about that?" he asked. But Jessica showed him her phone again. A breaking news alert. Thornhill Holdings acquires Morrison and Associates Architecture in surprise deal. The news had broken within the last hour, but Rothstein had worked quickly. Daniel hadn't even formally approved the purchase yet, but he realized his lawyer had moved based on their conversation's trajectory. "Daniel, what are you doing?" Jessica asked, her voice small, but there was genuine fear now. "I'm protecting my daughter," Daniel said, but he met Jessica's eyes directly. "And I'm taking control of my life in ways I should have done a long time ago." "What happens to Richard?" Jessica asked, but the question revealed so much about her priorities. "Richard's future depends on Richard," Daniel said carefully, but he wasn't ready to reveal all his plans. "If he's competent and ethical, there might be a place for him in the firm's restructuring. If not, you're going to ruin him," Jessica said, understanding dawning, but Daniel shook his head. "I'm not going to do anything to him," Daniel corrected, but his expression was hard. "His own choices have consequences. I'm just ensuring those consequences are felt appropriately." "Daniel, please," Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but they were crocodile tears, Daniel sensed, more about her situation than genuine emotion. "I made a mistake. I can see that now. The divorce, Richard, all of it was a terrible mistake." "Yes, it was," Daniel agreed, but his tone offered no comfort. "Can we start over?" Jessica asked desperately, but she reached for his hand. For Emma's sake, she needs both her parents together. Daniel looked at the woman he'd once loved, the woman he'd built a life with, but he saw only the shallow, status-obsessed person she'd revealed herself to be. Emma needs her parents to be healthy, stable, and focused on her well-being. Daniel said, pulling his hand away, but he continued, "Together or apart. Right now, apart is what works." "Because I left you when you were poor." Jessica's voice was bitter, but there was self-awareness creeping in. "And now that you're rich, you don't need me anymore." "No, Jessica," Daniel corrected firmly, but he wanted her to understand. "Because you left me when I was struggling, abandoned our daughter when she was sick, and chose a man's bank account over our family's integrity. The money doesn't change what you did. It just reveals what you valued all along." The words hit Jessica like physical blows, but before she could respond, Richard appeared at the end of the hallway. "Jessica, we need to leave," Richard called out, his voice strained. But when he saw Daniel, his expression darkened. "You." "Richard," Daniel acknowledged coolly, but he noticed Richard's disheveled appearance, so different from his usual polished presentation. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard demanded, striding toward them, but his anger was barely contained. "You can't buy Morrison and Associates. You're a junior architect with no management experience, no—" "I can, and I did," Daniel interrupted, his voice calm but firm, but he held Richard's gaze. "The board voted unanimously to accept Thornhill Holdings' offer. They were quite motivated by the debt situation you've been hiding from them." Richard's face went red, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You vindictive bastard," Richard spat, but Daniel's expression didn't change. "Interesting accusation from the man who slept with my wife, sabotaged my career, and fired me to damage my custody case," Daniel observed, but his tone remained conversational, which seemed to enrage Richard further. "I built that firm," Richard shouted, but hospital security was already approaching, drawn by the commotion. "You built debt, Richard. I'm cleaning up your mess," Daniel corrected, but he stepped back as security intervened. "Sir, you need to lower your voice," one security guard said to Richard, but Richard's fury was spiraling. "Do you know who I am?" Richard demanded, but the words were a death knell for any remaining dignity. "Yes, sir. You're the gentleman who needs to leave," the guard responded professionally, but his hand went to Richard's elbow to guide him away. "Jessica, come on," Richard ordered, but Jessica remained frozen, torn between the life she'd chosen and the life she was realizing she'd destroyed. "Jessica," Richard repeated, his voice harder, but Jessica looked at Daniel with something approaching desperation. "I need to think," Jessica said quietly, but Richard's expression turned vicious. "Think? Think about what?" Richard's voice dripped with contempt, but he was unraveling in real time. "He's destroyed everything. The firm, my reputation, our future, and you want to think?" "You destroyed yourself," Daniel said quietly, but the truth of it made Richard lunge toward him. Security intercepted Richard before he could reach Daniel, but the attempted assault was witnessed by multiple hospital staff and visitors. "Mr. Caldwell, you're being escorted off the premises," the head security guard announced, but Richard was still struggling against their grip. "This isn't over, Morrison," Richard shouted as they removed him, but Daniel watched impassively until Richard disappeared around the corner. Jessica stood in the hallway looking lost, but Daniel felt no pity for her predicament. "You should go," Daniel said, not unkindly, but he was done with this conversation. "Can I see Emma before I leave?" Jessica asked, her voice small, but Daniel considered the request. "For 5 minutes," he allowed, but he added, "But Jessica, Emma's surgery is in 3 days. She needs calm, positive energy, not drama." Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes, but as she passed Daniel to return to Emma's room, she paused. "I really did love you once," she said softly, but Daniel heard the past tense. "I know," Daniel replied, but he didn't add what he was thinking, that love hadn't been enough for her when it wasn't accompanied by wealth and status. The rest of the day passed in a blur of medical preparations and logistics, but Daniel handled each task with focused efficiency. He arranged for Emma's room to be filled with her favorite things, coordinated with Dr. Chen's team, and ensured every detail of her care was perfect. Melissa Chen arrived in the afternoon with property portfolios, but Daniel selected the Brooklyn Heights brownstone immediately, appreciating its private garden and proximity to excellent schools. "We can have you moved in by the end of the week," Melissa promised, but Daniel shook his head. "Tomorrow," he said, but he explained, "Emma's surgery is in 3 days. When she's released, I want her coming home to a place that feels safe and permanent." "Tomorrow it is," Melissa agreed without hesitation, but she was already making calls to coordinate the logistics. Rothstein called late in the afternoon with updates, but the news was all positive. Morrison and Associates was officially under Thornhill Holdings' control. Richard had been removed from all management positions, but offered a consulting role if he wanted to maintain some connection to the firm. He declined, Rothstein reported, but his tone suggested this was expected. Rather dramatically, I'm told, through a desk lamp at the board chairman. "So he's unemployed," Daniel observed, but he felt no triumph, just tired inevitability. "And facing assault charges from this morning's incident at the hospital," Rothstein added, but he continued, "The building he lives in has also accepted Thornhill Holdings' purchase offer. The closing is in 2 weeks." Everything was falling into place, but Daniel found himself thinking about his mother's letter, her warning about wealth corrupting everything it touched. "Harold," Daniel said carefully, but he needed to voice his concerns. "Am I becoming the kind of man my mother fled from, using money as a weapon?" Rothstein was quiet for a moment, but his response was thoughtful. "Your mother used her wealth to help people anonymously, to fund hospitals and schools, to make the world better without seeking recognition," Rothstein said. But he continued, "You're using your wealth to protect your daughter and hold accountable someone who deliberately hurt you and your family. Intent matters, Mr. Morrison. Your mother would understand the difference." "I hope so," Daniel said, but he wasn't entirely convinced. That evening, Daniel sat with Emma as she fell asleep, but her small hand in his reminded him why all of this mattered. She was getting healthy, would have the surgery she needed, would grow up in a safe home with opportunities his mother's wealth could provide. His phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Can we talk tomorrow? Really talk? Please." Daniel stared at the message, but he didn't respond immediately. Some conversations required careful thought, but others were simply postponing the inevitable. The next 2 days were consumed with preparations, but Daniel moved into the brownstone with a minimal amount of his own possessions, most of his furniture from the old apartment going to charity. Melissa had furnished the house beautifully, but Emma's room was designed specifically for a recovering child, with soft colors, comfortable furniture, and space for medical equipment if needed. Morrison and Associates restructuring was announced publicly, but Daniel appointed a competent COO to handle day-to-day operations while he focused on learning the business. Several senior architects approached him privately to thank him, but their relief at Richard's removal was palpable. The custody hearing was postponed at Daniel's request, but he'd already filed paperwork for sole custody, given Jessica's demonstrated pattern of prioritizing her own interests over Emma's medical needs. On the morning of Emma's surgery, Daniel arrived at the hospital at 5 a.m., but Emma was already awake, nervous but trying to be brave. "I'm scared, Daddy," she admitted, her small voice cracking. But Daniel pulled her close. "I know, baby. Being scared is okay," he said softly, but he continued. "But Dr. Chen is the best in the world, and in a few hours, you're going to start feeling so much better." "Will you be here when I wake up?" Emma asked, but Daniel nodded firmly. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, but he meant it in every possible way. Dr. Chen arrived with her team, her professional confidence reassuring, but she took time to explain everything to Emma in language an 8-year-old could understand. As they wheeled Emma toward the surgical suite, but she looked back at Daniel with trust in her eyes, and he felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. Jessica arrived just as Emma was being taken to surgery, but her appearance suggested she'd been up all night. No makeup, casual clothes, genuine distress evident, but Daniel let her stay in the surgical waiting room. "Thank you," Jessica said quietly, sitting 3 chairs away from Daniel. But the distance felt appropriate. They waited in silence for 4 hours, but when Dr. Chen finally emerged, her smile told them everything before she said a word. "The surgery was perfect," Dr. Chen announced, but she explained the technical details for their benefit. Emma's recovery should be straightforward, and within 6 months, she should be able to do everything normal children her age do. Jessica burst into tears, but Daniel felt his own eyes water with relief. His daughter would be okay, but more than that, she'd be healthy in ways she'd never been before. "Can we see her?" Daniel asked, but Dr. Chen nodded. "She's still groggy from anesthesia, but yes," Dr. Chen said, but she addressed Daniel specifically. "Mr. Morrison, I want to commend you. The decisions you've made for Emma's care over the past 3 days likely saved her life. Another few months of delayed treatment, and this surgery might not have been possible." The implication wasn't subtle, but Jessica's sob confirmed she understood her role in that near tragedy. In the recovery room, Emma was pale but peaceful, but when she saw Daniel, she managed a weak smile. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered, but Daniel took her hand gently. "Hi, sweetheart, you did so great," he praised, but Emma's eyes were already closing again. "Love you," she mumbled before falling back asleep, but those 2 words made everything worth it. Jessica stood on the other side of Emma's bed, but when Daniel looked up, she was crying silently, her carefully constructed facade completely gone. "She asked for you," Jessica said, her voice broken, but the observation was both acknowledgement and indictment. "Not me, just you." "You can rebuild that relationship," Daniel said, but he was surprised by his own generosity. "If you choose to prioritize her." "I will," Jessica promised, but Daniel saw genuine remorse in her eyes for the first time. "Daniel, I need to tell you something about Richard." "What?" Daniel asked, but he was wary of whatever revelation was coming. "He's been lying to me about everything," Jessica explained, her words tumbling out, but she seemed desperate to confess. "The money, the firm, even his feelings for me. I found documents in his apartment. He was only with me to get back at you for something that happened years ago." "Get back at me?" Daniel was confused, but Jessica nodded miserably. "You don't remember, but apparently in your 2nd year at the firm, you were chosen for a major project over him," Jessica explained. But the pettiness of it was stunning. "He's been holding a grudge ever since. Dating me, sabotaging your work, all of it was revenge for that." Daniel remembered the project, but it had been based on merit, not politics. He'd simply designed a better proposal, but Richard had clearly never forgiven him. "That's pathological," Daniel said, but he realized Richard's behavior made more sense through that lens. "He's been using me," Jessica said, her voice small, but the realization was clearly devastating. "I destroyed our marriage, abandoned our daughter, for a man who was using me as a weapon against you." "Yes," Daniel agreed, but there was no satisfaction in being right. "I'm so sorry," Jessica whispered, looking at Emma's sleeping form, but her regret seemed genuine, if too late. "Sorry doesn't fix anything, Jessica," Daniel said, but he wasn't cruel, just honest. "But you can do better going forward, for Emma." Emma's recovery took 3 days in the hospital, but Daniel never left her side except for brief bathroom breaks and one meeting with Rothstein to sign final documents on Morrison and Associates. Jessica visited daily, but her interactions with Emma were stilted, awkward, showing the damage done by 6 months of prioritizing a new relationship over her daughter. On the day Emma was discharged, Daniel had arranged for the brownstone to be filled with welcome home balloons and flowers, but Emma's face lit up when she saw her new room. "This is all mine?" she asked in wonder, looking at the space 3 times larger than her old bedroom, but Daniel nodded. "All yours, sweetheart," he confirmed, but he'd also arranged for a surprise visitor. "Emma," Dr. Chen called from the doorway holding a stuffed bear, but Emma's face brightened even more. "Dr. Chen, you came to my house," Emma exclaimed, carefully hugging the bear, but the doctor knelt down to her level. "I wanted to make sure you know how proud I am of you," Dr. Chen said warmly, but she handed Emma a medal. "This is for the bravest patient I've ever had." Emma beamed, putting the medal around her neck, but her joy was infectious, making even the adults smile. Over the next weeks, Daniel established a routine, but his focus remained on Emma's recovery and well-being. The business side of his inheritance was managed by competent professionals, but he made time to learn, attending meetings and reviewing reports. Morrison and Associates underwent restructuring, but under new management the firm's reputation began to recover. Several clients who'd left during Richard's mismanagement returned, but the architectural community noticed the positive changes. Richard himself had disappeared from public view, but Daniel heard through Rothstein that he'd taken a job at a small firm in New Jersey, his reputation too damaged for Manhattan's competitive market. Jessica had moved out of Richard's penthouse before Thornhill Holdings' purchase completed, but Daniel heard she was renting a modest apartment in Queens, working at a mid-level marketing firm. She visited Emma weekly, but the relationship was slowly rebuilding on more honest foundations. The custody hearing finally occurred 6 weeks after Emma's surgery, but the judge took one look at the medical records, Daniel's new stable home environment, and Jessica's documented pattern of prioritizing her relationship with Richard over Emma's medical needs, and awarded Daniel primary custody, with Jessica getting supervised visitation. Jessica had cried in the courtroom, but she'd accepted the judgment without argument, seeming to understand she'd earned this outcome through her choices. 3 months after inheriting Thornhill Holdings, Daniel stood in his mother's old apartment, now empty except for a few boxes of her personal effects. But Rothstein had arranged for Daniel to have time to go through everything before the apartment was sold. He found photo albums, but they told stories he'd never known. His mother as a young woman, clearly wealthy, dressed in designer clothes at charity galas, but her smile in those photos looked forced, performative. Then photos of his mother with his father, both young and clearly in love. But they were at a small apartment, a modest wedding, simple clothes. His mother's smile in these photos was genuine, radiant, but Daniel understood why she'd chosen this life. The final box contained journals, but Daniel opened the most recent one carefully. "Danny turned 40 today," his mother had written 2 years ago, but her handwriting was shaky with age. "He's working himself to exhaustion for Emma's medical bills, and I want so badly to help. But if I give him money now before he's ready, it might destroy him the way wealth destroyed my family. He has to forge his own character first, develop his own strength. Then the money will be a tool, not a crutch or a curse." Daniel read through years of entries, but each one showed his mother watching, caring, trusting that her decision to let him struggle was building him into someone worthy of the Thornhill fortune. "I'm dying," the final entry said, dated 3 days before she'd passed, but her words were clear, purposeful. "I've made my peace with leaving Danny alone with this burden. He's ready now. He's strong, principled, loving, everything the Thornhill family needed and never produced. He'll use the money well, I know it. He'll protect Emma, build something meaningful, and maybe, just maybe, find happiness I never could. I'm so proud of my son. I'm so grateful I chose the life that gave him to me instead of the life that would have corrupted us both." Daniel closed the journal, tears streaming down his face, but he understood finally why his mother had done what she'd done. She'd loved him enough to let him struggle, trusted him enough to become the man who deserved this inheritance, but most importantly, she'd shown him that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts. 6 months after the inheritance, Daniel hosted the first annual Thornhill Foundation Gala, but unlike his mother, he'd chosen to make his charitable giving public, hoping to inspire others while honoring her legacy. Emma attended as his guest, now healthy and energetic, but she'd helped choose several of the children's hospitals that would receive grants. Jessica attended as well, but separately, but Daniel noticed she'd brought a date, a high school teacher she'd mentioned during one of their co-parenting conversations. The man seemed kind, attentive, but most importantly, he clearly wasn't with Jessica for money or status. Morrison and Associates had been transformed, but under new leadership, the firm was winning major contracts and restoring its reputation. Daniel had announced plans to mentor young architects from underprivileged backgrounds, but the program was already oversubscribed. As Daniel gave his speech at the gala, thanking everyone for supporting the foundation's mission, but he looked at Emma in the front row, healthy and happy, and knew his mother had been right. The truest wealth wasn't in bank accounts, but in the people we love and the lives we touch. My mother once told me that character is forged in struggle, not comfort, Daniel told the crowd, but his words carried the weight of lived experience. She let me struggle because she trusted I would emerge stronger. Tonight, as we commit $500 million to causes she cared about, I honor that trust by ensuring others don't have to struggle alone. The applause was thunderous, but Daniel's eyes found Jessica's in the crowd, and for a moment they shared a look of understanding. She'd learned, through loss and consequence, what he'd always known, but perhaps there was wisdom in that journey too. Richard Caldwell wasn't at the gala, but Daniel had heard through industry contacts that Richard had quietly declared bankruptcy, his personal assets liquidated to pay debts. The penthouse had been repossessed, but Richard was now living with his aging parents in their Connecticut estate, working to rebuild his career from scratch. Daniel felt no satisfaction in Richard's fall, but he felt justice had been served through natural consequences rather than vindictive action. As the evening concluded and guests departed, Emma found Daniel on the brownstone's back terrace, but her medal from Dr. Chen still hung around her neck, worn daily as a badge of pride. "Daddy," Emma asked, climbing into his lap, despite being almost too big for it, but Daniel wrapped his arms around her. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are we rich now?" Emma's question was innocent, but it showed she was starting to understand their changed circumstances. "We have money now," Daniel corrected carefully, but he wanted her to understand the difference. But being rich is about more than money. It's about being rich in love, rich in purpose, rich in the good we do for others. "Like Grandma?" Emma asked, but Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Exactly like Grandma," he confirmed, but he kissed the top of her head. "She showed us that the best way to use money is to help people, to make the world better." "I want to help people too," Emma declared, but her determination was fierce, and Daniel smiled. "You will, Em, you absolutely will," he promised, but he meant it with every fiber of his being. Looking out over the garden, Daniel thought about the journey from that snowy parking lot to this moment, but every hardship, every betrayal, every struggle had been necessary to forge him into the man holding this precious daughter, managing this vast fortune and honoring his mother's legacy. Jessica had left him and their sick daughter in the snow, unaware he'd just inherited a massive trillion-dollar real estate empire. But what he'd done wasn't about shattering her or devastating her lover. It was about protecting Emma, claiming the life his mother had prepared him for, but most importantly, proving that character forged in struggle could wield wealth with wisdom rather than corruption. The man she'd divorced to marry his boss after his mom died had done something neither Jessica nor Richard expected, but he'd risen above revenge to embrace responsibility, above bitterness to choose purpose, above wealth to prioritize love. And in doing so, Daniel Morrison had finally understood what his mother had been trying to teach him all along, that the greatest inheritance wasn't money, but the strength of character to use it well.